There are very few games that have had a development cycle as tortured as Dead Island 2's. This game has been through the ringer. After initially being announced way back in 2014 as being developed by Spec Ops: The Line developer Jaeger, they were subsequently removed from the game, with development shifting over to Sumo Digital, the team best known for games like Little Big Planet 3 and Sackboy: A Big Adventure. But in 2019, the game once again passed hands over to Dambuster, the studio behind the disastrous Homefront: The Revolution, one of the worst games I played during the last generation. Needless to say, I've remained highly skeptical about Dead Island 2. Between the shaky reputation of the developer and the title's evidently tortured history, I wasn't feeling very optimistic about this game. I mean, how often do games with this kind of story behind them turn out well? I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone of the trash fire that was Duke Nukem Forever. But now, 11 years after the release of the first Dead Island 2 is finally here. And against all odds, it's actually pretty damn good. If you're looking for a deep, engaging story, or a game that revolutionizes action RPGs, then Dead Island 2 probably isn't the game for you. But if you're just in the market for some good old-fashioned zombie-slaying fun, you're in for a good time with Dead Island 2. Dead Island 2 begins with you picking one of 6 playable characters, each of whom has their own unique attributes and stats. Your choices are Jacob, a stuntman who hails from London, Bruno, a hustler who looks like every mumble rapper you've ever seen, jacked motorcyclist Carla, male stripper Ryan, Amy, a Paralympian runner with a prosthetic left leg, and finally, the character I chose, Danny, an Irish roller derby player who has a punky pin-up girl look. I chose Danny both for her awesome character design and her trade-off of low health for high stamina, as I always prefer playing as a more agile character in this kind of game. I was surprised by just how much I liked Danny. Her voice actor Michelle Fox does an incredible job, and I found myself regularly chuckling at Danny's dry, snarky remarks. Dead Island 2 begins with these 6 characters on a plane attempting to get out of LA during the start of a zombie outbreak. Unfortunately for them, their efforts to escape the City of Angels are fruitless, as immediately after takeoff, it becomes apparent that an infected person has made their way onto the plane, which causes the military to shoot the plane down to contain the virus, leading to your character awakening in the wreckage of the crash, mortally wounded. After making your way out of the plane, you're immediately thrown into the deep end and attacked by a group of zombies, leading to your character getting bitten. Only unlike everyone else, they don't turn into a zombie, so now they're left to figure out their role as someone immune to the virus in a city overrun with infected. And it's at this point you'll make your way into beautiful, sunny LA and get into the loop of what this game is. Like its predecessor, Dead Island 2 is an action RPG where you'll take on missions from various weird and wonderful NPCs and slash, smash and stab your way through a near endless amount of zombies to level up and continue the never-ending pursuit for more powerful weapons and abilities. The real star of Dead Island 2 is its stunning setting. I love the juxtaposition of the horrific zombie violence and the beauty of locations like Venice Beach. There are so many iconic locations to explore in Dead Island 2. Even as someone who's never set foot in America, I've seen places like the Santa Monica Pier in movies and TV shows a million times. The setting also presents a lot of comedic opportunities, as Dead Island 2 loves taking the piss out of all the reprehensible egomaniacs that inhabit LA. From past their prime actors to washed up rockers, there's no shortage of wacky side characters in Dead Island 2. There's even a familiar face in the mix, with one of the playable characters from the original Dead Island, Sam B, playing a pivotal role in Dead Island 2's story, which provides some cool connective tissue between the games, even though they were released so far apart. While Dead Island 2's writing is nothing groundbreaking, it's far more competent than I initially expected, and the world is filled with funny little visual gags, like an arcade machine that's clearly just Space Invaders called Cosmic Intruders. The first thing I immediately noticed playing Dead Island 2 is just how much more polished it is than its predecessors. Dead Island 2 runs smoothly, looks good, and is significantly less janky than 1 and Riptide were. Dead Island 2's combat is overall very good. At first, I found it a little stiff, but once I started upgrading my weapons and abilities a little, I quickly got into the groove of dodging, kicking, tactically dismembering, and head stomping enemies when they're knocked down, and found a satisfying rhythm in combat. Even more so once I got the timing down for perfect dodges, which can be followed up with a counterattack that kills standard zombies in one hit. I initially gravitated purely towards bladed weapons because I was finding that the heavy blunt weapons didn't quite have the weightiness behind their blows that I wanted them to. And let's be honest, when is lopping a zombie's head off with a katana not fun? But once I started to upgrade my weapons, I did grow to appreciate the bone-crunching brutality of heavy weapons like sledgehammers. Once a weapon like that is upgraded, and your hits are sending waves of enemies flying backwards, it feels awesome. But because the combat starts to come together once you've upgraded your weapons a bit, I don't think that Dead Island 2 puts its best foot forward, and I hope players don't just bounce off it within the first couple of hours when your weapons still feel flimsy, because by the end of the game, when you're just running into hordes of zombies, dodging their lunges, drop-kicking them off rooftops, and tearing them limb from limb with your most powerful weapons, Dead Island 2 can feel incredible. There are also plenty of firearms to play around with, but with a gun, you always run the risk of running out of ammo at an inopportune time. So I spent the majority of my time with Dead Island 2 working almost exclusively with melee weapons. Though credit where it's due, the guns do control infinitely better than they did in the old Dead Island games. Shooting feels punchy, and the bullets hit with a nice sense of impact. Like in the original Dead Island, where things get interesting is when you start crafting your own mod weapons, adding elemental and bleed damage to your weapons, at which point you're running around with guns that can electrocute enemies, blades that set zombies alight, and bats that have blades jutting out of them, so zombies take damage over time after taking a hit. Dead Island 2 also lets you mix up fights with curveball weapons, throwables that are unlimited but have a cooldown period after each use. These include meat baits, Molotov cocktails, pipe bombs, and even shuriken. As you continue playing, you'll start unlocking more advanced variations of these weapons, like baits that explode and electrified throwing stars. There are also environmental hazards that can both hurt you or be used to your advantage. So if you stumble across a fire, maybe you'll want to put it out, or maybe you'll want to kick a couple of zombies into it first to thin the crowd. Or you might see a frayed cable on the floor that you can douse in water to electrocute every nearby zombie. One of the main differences between Dead Island 2 and similar games like Dying Light is that Dead Island 2 is focused entirely on the zombies. There are no human enemies whatsoever in Dead Island 2. Despite this, Dead Island 2 still manages to offer a respectable amount of enemy variety. There are plenty of different zombie types, from the shambling walkers, to the brutish crushers, to swarm zombies whose bodies have been infested with a colony of bees that will swarm you if you get too close to them. There are also boss zombies, who are big hulking abominations that can withstand a ton of damage, and also give as well as they take, obliterating your health bar within a few hits. These are often your more goofy, themed zombies, like the ridiculous zombie brides and the nightmare-inducing clown zombies. Dead Island 2 is one of the most gratuitously violent games I've ever played, so if you're like me and you like your zombie games gory, you're in for a treat with Dead Island 2. When within the first few minutes of a game, you're jamming a high heel through a zombie's eye, and then stomping another zombie's head to a pulp as it crawls towards you with its entrails dragging behind it, you know that this is going to be an extremely grisly game. One of Dambuster's big talking points with Dead Island 2 has been their proprietary flesh system, which allows for what might be the most grotesquely detailed gore I've ever seen in a game. This system lets each body part respond to attacks uniquely and realistically. While the first Dead Island had dismemberment, this game takes the violence to another level. You're going to be seeing compound fractures, eyeballs popping out, skin and flesh flying off, brains bulging from skulls, pulsating organs, and shattered jaws dangling from heads, so Dead Island 2 certainly isn't a game for the squeamish. Eventually, you'll even find yourself using dismemberment for a tactical advantage. When fighting a crowd of zombies, you'll start hacking off zombies' legs to slow them down and make them a non-threat whilst you deal with other enemies. With your character being infected with the virus, they gain a handful of unique abilities, the first of which is Fury Mode. As you kill zombies, you fill up a Fury meter that once full allows you to go into a complete rage where you can rip even the most powerful zombies apart with your bare hands. The second ability comes into play through your skill cards. Instead of having a traditional skill tree, you modify your character's abilities with different skill cards, with each character starting with 2 unique skill cards and unlocking countless more throughout the game. Once you start figuring out which skill cards complement each other, you can start making some very overpowered pairings. For instance, I had one card that let me continue to stay in rage mode once my Fury meter was depleted, but it would start eating away at my health bar instead. But I also had a card that refilled my health whenever I killed a zombie in rage mode, so equipping both of these cards allowed me to stay in rage mode far beyond the normal limit. Where your character's infection comes into play is with autophage skills. These cards offer extremely powerful perks that also have a major drawback for using them. For example, one autophage card lets you set enemies on fire whenever you jump kick them, but in doing so, you'll also injure yourself. And if you start equipping multiple autophage cards, they'll begin to strengthen the hold the virus has over your character's body, causing additional debuffs like decreasing the effectiveness of all healing items. Dead Island 2 is a very simple and straightforward game, even with its RPG elements. You're equipping different skill cards and weapons, but that's it. There's no armour or gear scores to deal with, so you're not constantly worrying about min-maxing stats like you are in most RPGs. Dead Island 2 is lucky that its combat is so good, because the mission design is bog standard and hasn't evolved much from the Dead Island games of the PS3 and 360 generation. So expect a lot of fetch quests and objectives that are just to stand your ground and fight a couple dozen zombies before the mission can progress. Thankfully, these missions are given a bit more flavour through Dead Island 2's excellent selection of locations. Dead Island 2 isn't quite an open world game, as it doesn't offer a big interconnected map. Instead, the map is broken up into 10 zones that you fast travel between. Each map is fairly condensed, with no large empty stretches to traverse between points of interest, and that's because unlike the original games, Dead Island 2 doesn't have any vehicles to get around in, though I certainly never found myself missing them. Dead Island 2's 10 maps take you across many of LA's most iconic and glamorous locations. From the star-studded Hollywood Boulevard, to the picturesque Venice Beach, to the glitzy mansions of Bel Air and Beverly Hills that are home to some of the world's richest people. And it wouldn't feel like the true Hollywood experience if you didn't get to fight your way through at least a couple of movie sets, which are honestly some of the most interesting locations in the game, as you can use the pyrotechnics and electronic equipment on stage to kill zombies in a lot of fun ways. All of these real-world locations are brought to life in-game with meticulous detail, which makes them a joy to explore. There are unfortunately also a couple of weaker locations, like metro tunnels and sewers, which are already cliché settings for a zombie game, but feel all the more generic by comparison when the rest of Dead Island 2's locations are so great. One tiny detail that I need to give Dead Island 2 props on is its audio logs that are scattered throughout the world. Dead Island 2 handles audio logs correctly by letting you listen to them on the go after picking them up. It's astounding how many modern games still fuck this up after BioShock perfected audio diaries back in 2007. If you're going to make me sit in a menu while listening to audio logs, chances are I'm just not going to listen to them. The thing I love and appreciate the most about Dead Island 2 is its scope. This is a reasonably sized RPG that's not going to take you 100 hours to get through. Dead Island 2 has 25 story missions of varying lengths and 33 side missions, some of which have surprisingly interesting premises, arguably more so than the main story. I know when I look back on this game a couple of years from now, I'll remember the side missions that saw me helping a demented artist craft their magnum opus out of zombies' body parts, and not the main story of trying to make a cure for the virus. It takes maybe 10 to 12 hours tops to complete the story of Dead Island 2, and somewhere between 25 and 30 hours to see and do everything. I rolled credits at the 13-hour mark after doing a handful of side missions, but mainly focusing on the story to get all the different abilities unlocked as quickly as possible, as I realised that each new skill I unlocked was making Dead Island 2's combat more enjoyable. Afterwards, I dove back in to clean everything else up, and it took me 30 hours all up to platinum Dead Island 2, which feels like a great length for this kind of game. Long enough that I could get invested in my character, but not so long that Dead Island 2 overstayed its welcome. So many teams forget that bigger doesn't necessarily mean better, and prioritise quantity over quality, stuffing their games with dozens of hours of repetitive padding. While I've heard countless people talking about how impressive the gore looks in Dead Island 2, I don't think the game is getting enough credit for just how good it looks all around. While it's not mind-blowing, Dead Island 2 consistently looks good and maintains a stable frame rate of 60 frames per second, something that can't be said about a lot of other AAA games. The only area that is a little lacking visually is the facial animations, and there are a few minor cut corners, like the fact that none of the mirrors in the game are functional, which was a little jarring to see in a modern game, seeing as working reflections have been a standard part of most AAA games for over a decade at this point. There are a couple of other design issues with Dead Island 2 that make the game feel dated. For instance, when you die during a boss fight, you'll have to skip the cutscene that kicks off the encounter every single time you retry it. Why isn't there a checkpoint right after the cutscene? And Dead Island 2 does commit one huge gaming sin by ending with a very bad, overly long boss fight. Why does this kind of game always have to end this way? Everyone else has moved on from this. Why would you want your player's final memory of your game to be one of frustration? It's decisions like this that leave Dead Island 2 feeling more like an exceptional PS3 game than a great modern AAA game. Dead Island 2 is also an extremely safe game that doesn't have any ambitions beyond being a more refined version of what came before it. I hope now that Dambuster have proven that they have the chops to make this kind of game, that they'll be given a chance to make Dead Island 3 and use that opportunity to branch out and get more creative. With Dead Island 2, Dambuster has had one of the biggest glow-ups the video game industry has ever seen. Dead Island 2 isn't some artistic masterpiece, but sometimes that's not what you're in the mood for. Sometimes a solid 7 out of 10, where you slaughter thousands of zombies, is exactly what you need. Dead Island 2 is just pure video game comfort food. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe and leave a comment. You can find countless other videos on my channel, including my recent review of Resident Evil 4 and my recap of the PlayStation Showcase. And be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming review of Star Wars Jedi Survivor.